The current U.S. national debt is lying at around $20 trillion. Now, I need you all to listen to me today, because if we do not do something about if we do not stop HR 1, we will only be furthering the U.S. federal debt and also increasing poverty in the United States. According to Richard Sebula, a researcher and professor of economics from Georgia University, he said that a continuation of huge budget deficits, as well as could lead, among other things, a decline in the faith of the U.S. dollar, as well as jeopardize the U.S. currency as the prime use in the global economy. So, if we do not stop HR 1, we will have to be dealing with a staggering economy as well as increasing poverty throughout the United States. So in this speech, I will argue why we should not pass HR 1, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Firstly, and I will argue three main reasons why. The first reason I'll argue is that there are major problems with HR 1 which fundamentally harm those in poverty as well as decrease social mobility in the United States. Secondly, I will argue that the solution to HR 1 is staying with our current tax format, and we are much better off without it. And thirdly, I will be arguing that not passing HR 1 will not adversely affect the Republicans in the 2018 elections, as well as it will not grow the economy like they say it will. So, let's begin by first talking about why HR 1 why HR 1 will fundamentally be harming those in poverty as well as decreasing social mobility in the United States. Firstly, HR 1 plans on removing 3 tax brackets from our current system. What this is going to be doing is increasing the taxable minimum for those of low-income families. This is going to harm those low-income families' chances to rise up the socio-economic ladder, and it's going to result in an increase in poverty. Secondly, HR 1 plans on taxing graduate students based off of their graduate student support programs. Now, according to Daniel Reinholz, who is a professor of mathematics and statistics at Cal State San Diego, he said that there are currently 75% of PhD granting institutions offer instructor support programs, as well as 35% of master schools. Master schools, anyways. So this is going to be harming social mobility, because it will be a huge disincentive for those trying to go to school and pursue a higher education, because they're essentially getting taxed on money that is being loaned to them from the school. And thirdly, the bill is planning on reducing the tax rate on businesses to a flat 20%, and this is going to cause a major problem because according to Michael Sebula, who is a researcher at the NBER, which is the National Bureau of Economic Research, he said that when they do things such as pay-throughs in these tax cuts, 69% of the income that is raised from these tax cuts goes straight to the 1%. So it's not going to be benefiting the poor or helping those who need the money, really. So now that we talked about why HR 1 will fundamentally harm those who harm those in poverty as well as decrease social mobility, I will now argue why we are much better off without HR 1. Firstly, the last major tax cut in the United States had little to no effect in businesses in the first place. So if we do this tax cut, it won't be helping us much at all. According to Daniel Yeaghan, who is part of the American Economic Association, he said that in the 2003 dividend tax cut, there was little to no adverse effects with businesses. So we do not really need this tax cut in the first place. Secondly, by enacting this tax cut, we'll be causing huge federal budget deficits, which will result in the U.S. Losing more and more money, and will have to look to its other sources of income or cutting other government programs. And thirdly, our poverty rate is already decreasing in the United States, so we don't need a huge tax cut or tax reform such as this one. According to Mark Trumbull, economic editor, he said that what we really need right now is a good economy for the poor and support for low-income families policies that support low-income families could also help. So, now that we talked about why we're much better off without HR 1, I'll now talk about why I believe that why HR 1 will not affect the 2018 Republican elections like they said it will. So, firstly, according to Senator Paul Ryan, who is Speaker of the House as well as Senator of Wisconsin, he says that passing this bill is the best thing that Republicans can do to help bolster the economy and help the middle class family. However, we have already discussed why this is not going to be the case. And according to research done by Abigail Adams, as well as an article written by John Pottertz, which talks about why the truly forgotten voter, they say both that 66% of Americans already don't like the way that Republican Party is handling policies currently, and John Pottert's article talks about why people are currently very annoyed by Trump's takeover of the GOP and how they're dismayed by how the Republican Party is currently handling things. And lastly, I want to talk about why it will not grow the economy, because we saw what kind of effects it had on Kansas. So if we look at Kansas during 2012, during Governor Brownback's major tax cuts on businesses, we found that it did not bolster the economy, and in fact, it had quite the opposite effect, where the tax cut got so bad and resulted in such huge federal budget deficits for the state that they had to cut funding for programs such as for public schools, colleges, and Medicaid, and other programs. So, in this speech, I've talked about why I've talked about why we should not pass HR 1 and why it's going to be bad for us. I've talked about how HR 1 is fundamentally flawed and is not going to help put those in poverty, as well as it's going to decrease social mobility. I've talked about why HR 1 is not the solution and why we are better off without it. And lastly, I've talked about why HR 1 will not affect the 2018 Republican elections and why it will not grow the economy. I hope that by learning all these things that we can find an alternative to help deal with the current federal deficit, and HR 1 is clearly not the answer. Thank you.